Today I'd like to talk to you about modifying objects in Illustrator. Specifically, I want to talk about joining paths together, cutting paths, scaling, rotating, and distorting objects. So let's start off talking about joining paths together. We've already talked about how you use the pen tool in various ways to create objects. And you might recall that I mentioned that when you initially start drawing an object, it's what we call an open path, meaning that it's not a fully enclosed object yet. It has a distinct beginning point and a distinct end point. And I think I showed you that you can create a fully enclosed object by simply clicking again on that beginning point, and that creates an additional path that connects the final point, the end point, back to the beginning point to create a completely enclosed shape. But let's say that I had created an object, or started to create an object, and then I had grabbed one of my selection tools and deselected the object so that the object is no longer active, it's no longer selected. You'll notice that the edge of the object is no longer outlined in green, and you don't see any of the control bars. What if I want to join these two endpoints together in order to create a completely enclosed shape? All I have to do is go back and get the pen tool, click on either of these points, either the beginning point or the end point, and resume drawing again. I can click and drag to pull out a new handlebar on that point, and then return back to the starting point and click and drag again. Let me show you another way to use the pen tool to join paths. Let's say we want to create a long continuous line, but for some reason we stop in the middle of creating the line and we leave a gap in the center of the line. And we decide later that we want to join those two paths together. Once again, I would just go back to my pen tool, click on the endpoint of one path, and then click on an endpoint of the other path, and now these are joined together as a single path. Notice what's happening with the fill color here. I mentioned this in an earlier lecture, how the fill always connects the beginning point to the end point of the path. Even though this is not a fully enclosed shape, the fill color still extends from that beginning point to that end point. Let me show you another way to join two different paths together. So once again, I'm going to draw two paths. I'm going to draw it. I'm going to grab one of my selection arrows and just click an empty space here to deselect it. And then I'm going to come back and draw another path. And again, select one of my selection arrows, click in blank space to deselect it. And so now I want to join these two endpoints of these two different paths together. Well, as I just explained, I could grab the pen tool and click on the endpoint of one path and the endpoint on the other path, and that would create an additional segment of path that would connect these two objects together. There's another way to do that. I can take the white arrow selection tool and I can select the endpoint of this path. Notice how as I select that endpoint, the endpoint becomes green and the handlebars become activated. Now I want to also select the other endpoint of this other path. But in order to select more than one point with the white arrow tool, I have to hold down the Shift key. So I'm holding down the Shift key right now, and when I click on the second point, now that has allowed me to select two different points on two different paths. I'm now going to go up to the Object menu, down to where it says Path, and choose the command that says Join. And what that does is it draws a straight connection, an additional path, to connect the endpoints of those two lines together. So now these are joined together into a single path. But notice how that new connection is a perfectly straight line, and it creates this sort of awkward kink or stair step in the line. Maybe that's not what you want. Maybe you actually want this first path to flow directly into the second path without any kind of kink in the line. So let me undo what I just did and show you a different way to join these two paths so that it creates a nice smooth continuous shape. Once again, I've clicked in empty space here to deselect both paths. And again, with my white arrow, I'm going to click on the end of this one path to select the anchor point at the end of this path, hold down the Shift key, and select the beginning point of the next path. I'm going to go back up to the Object menu and go down to Path, but instead of choosing the Join command, I'm going to choose this other command called Average. And it brings up this dialog box. What this is asking me here is, do I want to reposition these 2 points so that they are lined up with one another horizontally, or do I want to line up these 2 points so they're lined up vertically, or do I want to align both objects vertically and horizontally? What that's going to do is it's going to position the 2 anchor points directly on top of one another. So let me click OK. And you see what it's done here is it's positioned the endpoints of both of these paths right on top of one another. But these are still 2 separate objects. Even though those points are sitting right on top of one another, they haven't actually been joined. So for example, if I were to grab my black arrow and select one of these shapes, I could still pick this shape up and move it independently. The 2 objects are not actually joined together. Let me undo that and undo it again, and we'll go back and repeat those steps again. I'm going to select the endpoint of this path, hold down Shift, select the beginning point of the next path, go to the Object menu, Path and Average, and select both and click OK. And again, I've repositioned those points so they're right on top of one another, but they're not joined yet. I need to make another step, go back to the Object menu, Path, and now I choose the Join command. The Join command takes those 2 separate endpoints and turns them into a single anchor point, connecting the 2 paths together. So now if I grab my black arrow, you'll see that this is now united as one continuous path, one continuous object. Now let's say I'd like to cut the path. Maybe I have a path that I want to cut up into shorter segments. There are several different tools that I can use for cutting a path. The scissor tool lets you simply click on the path to cut it into pieces. Notice what's happening with the fill here. Because I've now cut this path into 3 separate shapes, the fill color is now connecting the beginning and end point of this first shape, the beginning and end point of the second shape, and the beginning and end points of this third shape. Let me draw another object, this time a fully enclosed object. And demonstrate one more tool called the knife tool. The knife lets you cut across the fill of an object and divide the object up into multiple shapes. And I can actually draw sort of a zigzagging shape here, and it will divide the object along that zigzagging path. So let me click with the mouse and drag across the shape. Notice that it's drawing a little green line as I zigzag back and forth through this shape. And it has now divided this into two separate shapes. I can do that again, cut this once again with the knife tool, and we now have three separate shapes. Another tool that lets you cut enclosed objects into smaller pieces is the eraser tool, found under the same tab with the scissor tool and the knife tool. The eraser tool can be used to just cut small little bites out of an object. Notice how Illustrator creates additional anchor points and paths to define the shape of these little bites, these little indentations that I cut out of the object. But I can also use the eraser tool to cut all the way across an object and divide it into two pieces. I can now use the black arrow to drag these different pieces apart from one another. I can control the size of the eraser by double-clicking on its icon and adjusting the size. I now have a much fatter eraser that will take a bigger bite out of the object or cut a larger swath through the center of the object. I can adjust the size of the eraser on the fly without having to double-click on the icon by using the bracket keys on the keyboard. The left bracket, as I continue to type the left bracket key, reduces the size of the eraser, and the right bracket key, if I keep clicking, increases the size. Now I'd like to demonstrate 4 different tools that allow you to distort objects. These are the Rotate tool and the Reflect tool, which are both located under this same tab on the toolbar, as well as the Scale tool and the Shear tool, located under a different tab on the toolbar. I'm not going to demonstrate the Reshape tool because it's one that I never use. To demonstrate this, I'm going to grab a more complex object, this little schematic illustration of a cell. And what I want to do is, first I want to rotate it, then I want to reflect it and create a mirror image of it, then I'll scale it and shear it to demonstrate how these 4 tools work. Before I can use any of these distortion tools, I first need to select the object that I want to distort. This object is actually made up of many separate objects, many separate paths, so the best way to select it would be to take the black arrow and drag a selection all the way around it to make sure that I've selected every individual path, every component of the object. I'll show you at a later date how to actually create an object that looks like this. So let's say I want to rotate this. I select my Rotate tool from the tool palette, and there are 3 different ways that I can use the Rotate tool. The simplest way is to simply click anywhere on the image. I'll click right here in the center of the nucleus of the cell. So I click first, and notice that the tool icon now changes to this arrow. The second part of the process is to use the arrow to rotate the object around that initial point where I clicked. So the initial point where I click defines the center of rotation, and the object then rotates around that center of rotation. Let me try that again, but this time I'll click in a different location. I'll click down here in the cytoplasm of the cell, and again notice that when I click, the cursor turns into this arrowhead. I'm now going to drag with the arrowhead, and notice how the cell rotates around that initial point where I clicked. So that's one way to use the Rotate tool, is to click and drag. As a matter of fact, I don't even have to click within the shape. I can click off to the side of the shape, outside the shape, such as over here, to the right of the object. And that places the center of rotation out here away from the object. And now when I drag the object, notice how it rotates around that central point. Let me move it back here so we can see it. The second way to use the rotate tool is to simply double-click on the rotate tool. And that brings up a rotate dialog box. The advantage of double-clicking on the rotate tool is that when this dialog box comes up, it gives us the option of entering a specific angle. So let's say I enter 45 degrees and I click OK. It may have been hard to tell, but it rotated so that the highlight is now facing down towards the bottom left. In fact, let me reposition the cell so that the highlight is facing up towards the upper left. We'll try that again. I'm going to just double click on the rotate tool. And this time let me put in, say, 180 degrees. This should flip the highlight completely to the opposite side. Click OK. And notice the highlight is now facing down and slightly to the right. So that's the second method of using the rotate tool, is to simply double-click on the icon. Now the only problem with this double-clicking method is that I don't have any control over where the center of rotation is. You remember in the first method that I showed you, you would click first to define the center of rotation and then drag the object around that center of rotation point. Now the problem with that first approach is that you don't get to enter a precise angle. The second approach, you get to enter a precise angle, but you don't get to define the center of rotation. There's a third method where you get to do both, where you get to define the center of rotation and enter a precise angle. The way you do that is by holding down the Option key and then clicking to define your center of rotation. So I'm holding the Option key on the keyboard. I'm going to click here just to the left of the cell. And notice on screen, just to the left of the cell, there's a little light blue bullseye mark. That indicates the location of the center of rotation that I just defined. And at the same time, it also brings up the rotate dialog box. Let me click OK. And you see how the cell has rotated 180 degrees, and it's rotated around that little target, that center of rotation that I defined. Let's try that again. I'm going to place the center of rotation even farther away from the cell. I'm going to hold down the Option key and click to the right of the cell. And notice that, again, that it places that little target, that center of rotation point, to the right of the cell, right where I had clicked. And it brings up this dialog box. Let's use 180 degrees again. But let me show you one other feature of this tool. I can check this box that says Preview, and that shows me where the object is going to be positioned after I click OK. Obviously, I haven't clicked OK yet. This is just giving me a preview of where the object will end up. So now I click OK, and that's where it goes. Let me show you one other feature of the Rotate tool. Once again, I'm going to Option click, so I'm holding down the Option key. I click with the mouse. That Preview button is still checked, so we're seeing a preview of where the cell is going to end up after I hit OK. But this time, instead of hitting OK, I'm going to hit Copy. What this does is it leaves the original object where it was and creates a duplicate of that object in the new position. So you can see I've got one upside down cell, with the highlight facing down towards the bottom right, and another cell with the highlight facing towards the upper left. It's a quick way to duplicate an object by rotating it and simultaneously making a copy of it. The next tool I want to show you is the Reflect tool, and this functions in a very similar way. You have all of the same options, the same approaches to using this tool as you did with the Rotate tool. You can simply click and drag, you can double click the icon, or you can option click. Let me select the cell, grab that Reflect tool, and demonstrate to you that I can click with the mouse to define a sort of a center of rotation. In this case, since we're reflecting the shape, we're creating a mirror image of it, the point where I click is almost like where the mirror is located. And I'm going to reflect the object across that mirror to create a mirror image of it on the other side of that initial point where I clicked. So that's the click and drag method. I can also double click on the Reflect tool, and I can say reflect the object horizontally or across a horizontal axis. Notice I've got preview turned on, so when I select this, you'll see what it's doing is the highlight was at the top, now it's putting the highlight down at the bottom because it's reflecting it from top to bottom across a horizontal axis. Or I could say reflect across a vertical axis. So now the highlight used to be over on the right, it's reflecting it over to the left, reflecting from right to left across a vertical axis. Or I could reflect it across some angle. Click OK, and it positions it there. Now let me show you the option click method. I hold down the option key, and I click to define this center of rotation, so to speak, or center of reflection. Again, the preview is on, so it's showing me how this object is going to look when it reflects across a vertical axis from right to left. But this time, let me hit the copy button, and we see that we create a duplicate, which is an exact mirror image of the original object. Next, let me demonstrate the Scale tool. This also has those same three options. I can simply click anywhere on the object and then drag to scale the object up. The point where I initially clicked is remaining stationary. That part of the object is not moving. But as I scale the object, the rest of it is moving away from that initial point where I clicked. Now, one problem with this click and drag method with the Scale tool is that depending on the direction that I drag, I might end up squashing the object vertically or squashing it horizontally. I have to be very careful that I don't distort the object unless I want to. I mean, if I wanted to squish something horizontally or squish it vertically, I could certainly do that. I'm going to undo a couple times to go back to my original cell. Now, one way to prevent any kind of distortion of the object is to hold down the Shift key as you're dragging it. So I'm going to click again on the cell. I'm going to drag, and if I'm sloppy about the way I drag, I can squish the object either vertically or horizontally. But if I hold down the Shift key, that constrains the scaling so that it scales it equally in the vertical and horizontal dimensions. I can also use the double click method to bring up a dialog box, and I can enter a precise percentage. Let's increase the size of the cell up to 150%. and click OK. And I also can use the option click method where I click to define that point that's going to remain stationary. I'm going to click far to the upper left of the cell. And right now it's set to scale at 150%. Let's scale it down. Let's scale it down 50%. And click OK. I'm just going to scale this back up a little bit. And let me show you the shear tool. The shear tool lets you skew an object. And you have all of the same choices with the skew tool as you did with the others. You can click and drag and it skews or stretches the object. I can double click. Now this is a little bit more difficult to master because it's hard to know exactly what these different values represent. The shear angle is talking about how much you're distorting it, and the axis is describing the direction that the object is being skewed in. Let's put in a positive number here. Let's put in, say, 80 for the shear angle. And click OK. And yeah, the results are a little bit unpredictable unless you really know what those numbers mean. Let me undo a couple times. The next thing I'd like to show you is called envelope distort. Envelope distort is a group of techniques for distorting objects located here under the object menu. There's a submenu called envelope distort. And we have three different ways of distorting an object. There's something called make with warp, make with mesh, and make with top object. To demonstrate this, I'm actually going to close this window. And I have the same cell here on a different page. Let me show you how this works. I'll start out by demonstrating what's called make with warp. I have to select the entire cell, or the group of objects first, using my black arrow and dragging a selection around that. And go back up to the object menu, envelope distort, and I'm going to choose make with warp. This brings up a dialog box that has a little pop-up menu up at the top, and when I click on this little pop-up menu, you can see that it describes all sorts of shapes like arcs, arches, bulges, flags, even some weird things like fish. What the warp distortion is doing is it is going to try to squeeze that cell. It's going to squeeze whatever shapes I have selected in Illustrator into one of these kind of shapes. So let me turn on preview and we'll see what happens when we're trying to squeeze that cell into an arc shape. You see what's happening there is that it's drawing an arc, which is highlighted in green, and it's distorting the cell into that arc or arch. We click OK, and you see what we end up with. Now that this has been created, I can actually take my white arrow, and I need to first click out here in empty space to deselect. But I remember roughly where some of those points were. I can actually select the anchor points on the arc and create further modifications to my object by simply moving those anchor points around on the arc, which is actually what's known as the envelope. The envelope is the object that is distorting the original artwork. I'm going to go back to the object menu, back down here to envelope distort, and I can choose release, which is going to eliminate that envelope. It's going to eliminate the arc shape and restore the artwork back to the original cell. Now what it's done here is it's turned the arc into a gray object, which I can just select and delete, and you see that I've got my cell back. Let me select that again, and I'll just give you another example of a different type of warp. Go to the Object menu, Envelope, Distort, Make with Warp. Instead of an arc, let's choose something else. How about a flag? What this does is it takes your artwork and distorts it to look like a waving flag. Now this would be an interesting technique to use if you had drawn a picture of, say, the American flag as a straight rectangle without any ripples or waves in it, and then you simply applied this flag warp option to turn that perfectly rectangular flag into a curving waving flag. It'd be kind of a quick way of achieving that effect. With any of these warp options, you have all sorts of control over the amount of curvature of the shape. We can curve it in the opposite direction. And then a lot of parameters that, I'll be perfectly honest, I haven't explored them enough to know exactly what they all do. So it's just the sort of thing you have to kind of play around with to get the feel for what these different options do. Once again, I can grab the white arrow. I have to deselect first, but then I can select individual anchor points on that envelope object to further distort the shape. We delete that, and now let's try something called Make with Mesh. I have to select all of the shapes that make up the cell, go to the Object menu, Envelope, Distort, and this time I'm going to say Make with Mesh. This time the dialog box asks us to define a grid, or what they call a mesh in this case. It's a grid that consists of horizontal rows and vertical columns, and I have control over the number of rows and columns. I'm actually going to reduce this down to just 2 rows and 2 columns because it's easier to demonstrate that way, and then I'll try another one where I create something a little more complex. Click OK. As of right now, it hasn't done anything to the object. The object hasn't been distorted, but you can see that it's created this grid, or this mesh, consisting of 2 horizontal rows and 2 vertical columns, and there are a series of anchor points at the corners of this grid. Once again, I'll choose the white selection arrow, deselect, but now I know roughly where some of those anchor points are located. I can grab them and move them around to freely distort the object. I forgot to point this out earlier, but notice that these anchor points also have things that look sort of like handlebars or control bars. And these also allow me to stretch and distort the artwork. So by moving the anchor points as well as the handlebars, you have a lot of control over deforming the objects. Let me release that by going back to Envelope, Distort, and Release. And I have to select that gray shape and delete it. And that brings back my original cell. I'm going to grab the black selection arrow again, select the entire cell. Once again, go up to Object, Envelope, Distort. Let's make a little bit more complicated mesh this time. Let's put in, say, 6 rows and 4 columns. You can see how much more detailed the mesh is this time. Now with my white arrow, I can move all of these little points around and create much more complex distortions of this shape. Okay, that's Make with Mesh. Let me delete that. Let me actually show you an example of some artwork created by one of my colleagues that made extensive use of this envelope distort feature. This is by a friend of mine named Dave Ellert, who works out in Seattle. And believe it or not, this illustration was done entirely in Adobe Illustrator. He created a series of gradients and other effects to create the illusion of 3 dimensions. These are things that I'll demonstrate to you at another time. And one of the things he needed to do was he needed to place this text onto the surface of these kidney-shaped bags, these kidney-shaped IV bags, and he needed to distort the text so that it appeared to follow the contour, the shape of the outside of the bag. You can particularly see that here on the kidney on the left. And I've actually replicated what he did using some text here. At the top, I've actually typed out the text using just plain Helvetica font. Right below that, I've converted the text into a series of shapes. We'll talk about this again later, but let me just quickly demonstrate how you do that. You select a block of text, you go to the Type menu, and choose Create Outlines, which converts the text into a series of shapes. Let me zoom in on this a little bit. These are now all filled in Illustrator shapes consisting of anchor points and paths. That's what I have down here as well. Now that the text has been converted into a series of shapes, we can apply one of these envelope distort functions to it. I'm going to choose Make with Mesh. And let's see, I think I want about 3 horizontal rows and probably about, well, maybe 4 vertical columns. And now with my white arrow, I can select individual points and begin to distort the text the same way that Dave Ellert did for his kidney illustration. And you can see what I came up with down here at the bottom. So I don't use these envelope distort options all the time, but every now and then you find an application for them, and they can be extremely useful. Let me show you the third and final type of envelope distort, called Make with Top Object. In this case, you have the object, once again, the same old cell, and you draw an additional shape on top of that object. And in this case, it's filling it in with gray, but it really doesn't matter. Makes no difference what the fill and stroke color of the foreground object is. You select both the artwork that you want to distort as well as this new object that you've drawn on top of it. And again, the easiest way to do that is to just drag that black arrow across everything. Go to the Object menu, Envelope Distort, Make with Top Object. There are no options here. All it does is it uses that foreground object to distort the original artwork. And once again, by selecting the white arrow, I could come in here and grab some of those anchor points on that top object and even grab the handlebars and make further modifications to that shape. Here's one that I actually use quite frequently. The cell that I've drawn is actually a lymphocyte, a type of white blood cell. This includes the B cells and the T cells that are part of your immune system. And one thing that white blood cells are known to do is a process called diapedesis, where white blood cell will squeeze through the wall of a blood vessel to escape into the surrounding tissues. This usually happens during the process of inflammation. And so I've had a number of occasions where I needed to draw a white blood cell squeezing through the endothelial lining of a blood vessel. And so I've used this make with top object envelope distort feature, drawing sort of an hourglass shape on top of the cell, and then saying object envelope distort make with top object. And with a few little tweaks, I can create a fairly convincing picture of a cell that's squeezing itself through a narrow space. Next, I'd like to talk to you about the Pathfinder palette. The Pathfinders are a set of tools that allow you to join objects together or use one object to cut a hole out of another object. Notice here on screen there's a palette called Pathfinder. I can separate this from the other palettes, move it around anywhere I want on screen. And remember from a previous lecture that if I wanted to, I could hide this palette by clicking the little X in the upper left corner. And then if I need the Pathfinder palette and I don't see it here on screen, I can always retrieve it by going to the Window menu and selecting Pathfinder, and the palette reappears. I can also nest it with some of the other palettes, either by dragging it to the bottom of one of these existing palettes, or I could even drag it right on top of one of the other palettes, like so, and I now have two different palettes here that I can access using these different tabs. So let me show you how the Pathfinders work. I'm going to create some simple objects, and I'll start off just by creating a pair of ellipses. I'm going to select both ellipses by dragging across them with the black arrow, and now I'm going to position the cursor over the first icon here in the Pathfinder palette. This one's called Unite. What this does is it joins the two objects together. Any two objects that overlap can be joined into a single object. Let me undo that. The next Pathfinder is called minus front. What this does is it uses the foreground object to take a bite out of the object behind it. Let me show you. Notice how the larger ellipse in the front has disappeared, but where it overlapped the smaller ellipse behind it, it took a little bite out of it. Let me undo that. I'm going to create a smaller ellipse inside or on top of this larger ellipse, and let me select just those two, and let me use that minus front Pathfinder again. And in this case what's happened is that the small ellipse has actually punched a hole right through the middle of the larger ellipse, so that space is now hollow. And I can confirm that by selecting the other ellipse in the background and moving it, if I can get hold of it, so that you can see that the ellipse in the background now shows through that empty hole in the middle. Let me create a couple of other objects. I'll just choose some polygons this time. The next Pathfinder is called intersect. What this does is it takes two objects, and when I click this tool, we'll see what happens. Most of the objects disappear, leaving only the area where the two objects intersected or overlapped one another. Let me undo that. The opposite of that is called exclude. When I choose this pathfinder, the area where the two objects overlap disappears, leaving only the areas of the objects that don't overlap. Let me undo that. Then there's a group of other pathfinders across the bottom here, which I don't use very often. Occasionally I'll use this first one, called divide. When I select this pathfinder, what happens is it has actually split these two objects up into three. Actually, these are grouped together. So in order to select the individual components of this group, I need to use the white arrow with the plus sign. And you can see that I can actually separate these different pieces of the object. So the area where they overlap is a separate object, and the areas outside of the overlap are also separate objects. I'm not going to bother demonstrating the other tools because, like I say, I don't use them very often, but you can feel free to experiment with those on your own. Next, I'm going to demonstrate something called the Perspective Grid tool. The Perspective Grid tool creates a grid or a mesh that appears to disappear into the distance using two-point vanishing point perspective. And as I draw objects onto this grid, the objects are automatically deformed so that they appear in perspective. Let me show you how this works. In order to access the Perspective Grid tool, I select that tool from the tool palette, and notice that it turns on this grid that appears like a cube that is vanishing into the distance using two-point perspective. You notice that one side of the cube is vanishing to that point in the distance, and the other side of the cube is vanishing towards a different point in the distance. Notice also that one side of the grid is highlighted in blue, meaning that this is the active side of the grid. So as I draw objects, these objects are automatically stretched or deformed to conform to that vanishing point perspective on the left side of this cube. Let me draw another shape. And even though I'm using the rectangle tool and creating simple rectangles, they're automatically deformed into that vanishing point perspective. Right now, as I draw these objects, they're snapping to the left side of the cube, the active side, which is highlighted in blue. What if I wanted to create an object on the other side of the cube that appeared to be vanishing into the distance on the right side? Well, notice when I selected the Perspective Grid tool, this other little icon popped up showing a little cube with three different sides. And notice that the upper left side is currently highlighted in blue. That means that the left face of this cube is currently active. If I wanted to draw something that vanished towards that right-hand vanishing point, I would select the upper right-hand face of the cube in that little icon. And now, as I draw objects, they conform to vanishing point perspective on the right side of the cube, vanishing towards that right-hand vanishing point. I can also select the bottom of the cube, and now when I draw objects, they're deformed to conform to essentially the floor surface, the bottom of this vanishing point grid. Let me reselect the left-hand side of the grid again. Oh, I have to go back to the Perspective Grid tool in order to do that. Now I can select the left side of the grid, and let me just draw one more rectangle. There's another tool hiding here under the Perspective Grid tool, known as the Perspective Selection tool. And this allows me to do a couple things. This allows me to take any object that is already snapping to one of these perspective grids, and as I move the object around, the object appears to disappear into the distance, following that perspective grid. So in other words, as I move the object to the left, not only does it move to the left, but it also gets smaller as it moves towards that vanishing point. And I could continue to drag it farther and farther to the left, closer and closer to that vanishing point. Or of course I could do the opposite, move it to the right, and it would get bigger and bigger. Oops. Have to get hold of it properly. There we go. See, now it's become huge. And if I drag it down, it changes the orientation of the rectangle, again to conform to that perspective grid. I can also grab these individual points to resize the object. I can either make it narrower, I can make it shorter or taller, or I could do both. Grabbing one of the corner points lets me resize it in both the vertical and horizontal dimension. But again, as I resize the shape, it continues to conform to that perspective grid. Another interesting feature of this perspective selection tool is it lets me take other artwork that I may have already created previously, artwork that did not originally conform to this grid, and it lets me snap that new artwork to the perspective grid and automatically distort it. Let me demonstrate. First, I'm going to delete this rectangle. I'm going to just choose one of the regular selection arrows, and I've copied some artwork which I'm going to paste into the window. And you can see that it's that cell that I used earlier to demonstrate the envelope distort tool. The cell is drawn as if I'm looking straight at it. It doesn't have any sense of perspective to it. Let me select the cell, and now I'm going to go back and grab that perspective selection tool. And now when I grab the object with that perspective selection tool, it automatically deforms it to conform to that perspective grid. And specifically, it conforms it to the active surface, the active face of the perspective grid. In this case, that upper left face was active. And as I drag the object around using that perspective grid selection tool, once again, it decreases the size or increases the size according to the vanishing point perspective. I can also deform the shape using this little bounding box that surrounds the object, making it taller and skinnier, stretching it, scaling it, and again, it always conforms to that vanishing point perspective. Let me deselect the object, choose a different face of the grid. I'm going to paste in another copy of the cell. I'll go back to my regular selection arrow and pull it over. But now I'll go back to the perspective selection tool and grab hold of the cell. And now it deforms the cell to conform to the right-hand surface of the perspective grid, because that's the one that I've activated in the little icon here. If I want to hide that perspective grid or remove the perspective grid, now if I continue to create new objects, every object that I create is going to be deformed to conform to whichever face of that grid is active currently. Well, what if I want to just draw some artwork at this point that doesn't automatically snap to the perspective grid? What if I just want to draw a normal star, for example, that isn't automatically deformed? I have to turn off the perspective grid in order to be able to do that. In order to turn off the grid, all I have to do is close this little icon up here. I actually have to use one of the perspective grid tools in order to do that. And I just click on the little X in the upper left corner of that icon. The icon disappears, but more importantly, the perspective grid also disappears. And now, as I start drawing new objects, they have their normal orientation. They are no longer distorted into perspective. One last thing I'd like to show you about the perspective grid tool. You're not always stuck using this same grid. You can actually modify this existing grid or even choose different grids to use different types of vanishing point perspective. Let me show you. Using the perspective grid tool, I can select various points on the grid and adjust the size and shape of the grid. I could grab this left point and pull it in, or drag it farther out. I can grab this top point and stretch the grid up higher, bring it down lower. I could grab the bottom of the grid and pull it down. So I can reorient the position of the grid. Notice I can also pull the horizon line up or lift the entire grid higher up on the page. So lots of control and flexibility with repositioning the grid. However, notice that the artwork that I had already created does not automatically reorient itself to align to the new grid. In addition to changing this 2-point vanishing point grid, I can go to the View menu, and there's actually a menu item for controlling the perspective grid. You have the option of hiding and showing the grid down here. But I can also choose different types of perspective. So right now we're using 2-point vanishing point perspective, but I could switch to 1-point perspective. So this is the classic type of vanishing point perspective where it looks like you're looking down a road that's disappearing off into the distance. Again, none of the existing art is modified to conform to that new grid, but any new artwork that I create automatically conforms to the new grid. And finally, I can choose 3-point perspective. Let me slide that up if I can, so we can see it better. We now have 3 vanishing points, one to the upper left, one to the upper right, and also a vanishing point down at the bottom. And again, I can move the grid around to change the perspective grid. And then as I create new artwork, it automatically conforms to that new grid. And let me choose, in this case it would be the top face. Or the right-hand face.